Author Donna J. Jodhan presents The Christmas Box Set Number 2. If you have not yet listened to Donna's 12 Days of Christmas Box Set Number 1, then you owe it to yourself to do so. This box set is made of 12 wonderful stories for the Christmas holiday season. They are all filled with mystery, suspense, and they all have happy endings. Now, Donna presents her second 12 Days of Christmas box set, 12 stories with wild imaginings. Donna paints pictures of hope, peace, and a bright future for the world. She develops amazing stories that will warm and thrill the hearts of the listener. Sit back now and enjoy Donna's 12 stories. You can email your thoughts and feedback to Donna at donnajodhan@gmail.com. Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everyone.
Ho, ho, ho! I'm Detective DJ, also known as author Donna Jodhan, and I am pleased to be here with you for the 4th episode of my 12 Days of Christmas box set stories. I hope that everyone is enjoying this wonderful time of the year with peace and joy and cheer and greetings to each other. Even if you don't know the person you're greeting, just greet them with a ho, ho, ho. And why not? All right, so I am on to my 4th episode. And for this episode, before I give you the name of this episode, I hope that you have had some time to enjoy my previous 3 episodes. Okay? The first episode was entitled Santa's Special Christmas Sleigh. The second was entitled The President's Christmas Packages. The third was entitled Santa's Super Christmas Kids. And now on to the 4th one, Santa's Magic Marvels. And here is a description to my story. Santa has always wanted to provide somewhere special for those in need to spend the Christmas holidays. And for this year, Santa has something very special in mind. However, as normal, something unexpected happens, and the plan almost goes off track. But then, thanks to a very special phone call from an unexpected person, things change in a hurry. Some expected help comes to Santa's rescue on the way, and some very unexpected things happen. Santa has to use all of his wisdom to make sure that his magical place is kept intact. Find out what Santa has to do in order to preserve his magical retreat and who helps him out. Top secrets must be kept from those whose only mission is to spoil Santa's mission. Santa, of course, wins in the end. And now we're on to part 1. Santa reads moving letters. After a very hectic Christmas the previous year, Santa has taken some time off to rest and relax. He has decided to spend time learning to play the piano, and Mrs. Claus joins him, and his brother Sandy Claus and his family and other family members decide to move closer to the North Pole. And cousins Santa Stoyan and Santa Stefan also do the same. So now all of the families are about 500 miles away from the North Pole, much closer than they were before now. But Santa was hoping that they would all move to the North Pole, and because there is more than enough room for everyone. But who knows? So Despite relaxing and resting, Santa takes a bit of time to read those letters that are constantly coming into him. And his newly adopted kids, who you met in episode 3, are helping him to read these letters. And they are all located in hundreds and hundreds of bulging bags of mail, while his elves and other helpers are going about their business with the normal tasks of this time of the year, this being to clean up leftover things from last year's Christmas, then to start planning for this year's mission. You may think that it is a bit early for planning for this year's mission, but at the North Pole, it is never too early to start planning for Christmas of this year. Oh no, the reindeer, the snowbirds, the dolphins, and the lambs are all taking things a bit easy, but they still remain engaged, and they're engaged in light training and different activities, and they also engage in regular fraternizing with each other, while the mermaids are busy with their own affairs, but always ready to help at the drop of a hat whenever Santa needs them. As for Santa's newly adopted kids, they are still getting used to having Santa and Mrs. Claus as their new parents. Santa has built a huge happy house for them and has named it the Happy House. Santa has encouraged his adopted kids to start exploring the massive complex of the North Pole and to get to know the reindeer, the snowbirds, the dolphins, the lambs, and even the mermaids. And they have all welcomed this. The kids still have light training sessions daily and intense schooling to develop their academic studies, along with an hour each day to help Santa with his letters. But on weekends, they can simply relax and do whatever they wish. Some of the kids take up singing and music lessons. Others pursue cooking lessons, while others go after woodworking and carpentry, pottery, knitting, and home decorating. Others engage in learning to play chess, table tennis, and other types of games. Most of the boys play soccer, football, ice hockey, and basketball, while many of the girls play or ice skate and play netball. And the kids take advantage of the North Pole's huge ice rink, the ball courts, and the ski trails. However, with the permission of Santa's staff, they can also travel via helicopter to swim and surf in those faraway beaches and to swim in the warm water of the refreshing ocean. Naturally, the kids have small squabbles amongst themselves from time to time. But before they could become too serious or out of hand, Santa's elves and helpers are there to make sure that business is taken care of and that things return to normal. It is an early evening in February and winds are blowing around outside. Santa is relaxing in his Santa chair and meditating a bit when Mrs. Claus enters with some letters in her hands. She hands them to her hubby and asks him to read them. Oh boy! And as he reads, Santa becomes extremely serious, and Mrs. Claus sees that familiar frown spreading across her husband's face. Oh boy! Her hubby's brain is starting to race, and she knows only too well that he is more than likely to have some very different types of adventures soon. Santa reads and rereads some of the letters, and at the end of it all, he chooses 3 of them and hands them to Mrs. Claus. First letter is as follows. Dear Santa, my mom does not know that I am writing this, but I managed to get one of my neighbors to mail it to you. She told me that she gave it to her husband, who is a soldier in the Polish army, and asked him to mail it to you. My name is Karina, and my mom's name is Laura. I am 9 years old, and I still believe that there is a Santa. We have been living in Poland ever since we left the Ukraine about a year ago. My dad stayed behind to fight the Russians, and now my mom and I are all alone in Poland. We get food, and I go to school every day, but we don't have any family around. They are all back in the Ukraine. The doctor here recently gave us some bad news. Mom has cancer, and she's so very sad. She cries every night for my dad, and I do not know what to do. I miss my dad so very much, and we have only heard from him but twice since coming to Poland. Please, Santa, can you help me and my mom and bring my dad home? Love, Karina. The second letter was this one. Dear Santa, I live in the far north of Quebec on a reserve. I have lost my wife and 2 young girls to COVID, and now I am afraid that I will probably catch it. I am all alone in one tiny home and in one tiny room that serves as everything for me. Kitchen, bedroom, and a bathroom and toilet outside. Most of the time I am very cold in my little room, and I only get fresh water once a week. My neighbors are very nice to me, Santa, but I am all alone and I'm very lonely. I have no family, just me and me alone. Now that my wife and little girls are gone, it's just me. I am probably too old to believe in Santa Claus, but I thought I would try writing to you anyway. I am going to mail this letter when I walk to the post office on this reserve where I live. I hope you receive it. I am not sure what to ask for, but anything you give me would be more than welcomed. Thank you, Santa Claus. Schofield. And the third letter was this. Dear Santa, I recently lost my job as a security guard in an electronics supplier in New Hampshire. The company is now closed, and I have been home now for 6 months. I have a very sick little boy with leukemia, and he now needs very urgent treatment. But I have no money to pay for this. My husband just walked out on me, and now I am a single parent. I have used up all of my savings to survive and to pay for my little boy's medical treatment. And now I am on social welfare. Santa, I am very scared because I do not know what next to do. I know that Santa helps kids. So now I am asking you to please help my little boy. I hope you read my plea for help. Yours truly, Kimberly, and my boy's name is Lucas. Mrs. Claus read the 3 letters once more and handed them back to her husband, nodding her head as she did so. And this was what it was at this time. Part 2. Santa makes an important decision. If for the next few days Santa became engrossed in something or other, and for the most part Mrs. Claus left him to his own devices, because she knew only too well that he would eventually share his thoughts with her, and she did not have to wait for too long. Santa shared his thoughts with his wife at dinner a few nights later. He told her that those 3 letters had really touched him, and he had been thinking of how he could help those who had written these letters to him. Mrs. Claus nodded, smiled, and told her husband that she was sure that he could find a way. Santa shared with his wife that maybe, and just maybe, he could create and develop this year's mission using these 3 letters as the reason for this particular mission. It would entail a lot of work, but Santa was ready for it. Santa had always wanted to build some sort of Christmas resort or retreat where he could host many folks from around the world who needed somewhere to celebrate the Christmas holidays, because they had nowhere to go, nor did they have anyone to celebrate Christmas with. Santa could build this sprawling Christmas resort on land that he owned in a very secret location, which was away from the North Pole and one that offered year-round activities, no matter what type of weather there was. First, however, Santa had to scope out this possibility. Next, he needed workers to help him build it. Then, he had to choose those who he really thought needed such a grandiose gift. Finally, to put everything together. It was going to be more than a huge undertaking, and Mrs. Claus reminded him of it. But the big man in the red suit only chuckled, scratched his ample beard, and smiled broadly at Mrs. Claus. He reassured his wife that he had everything in hand, and over the next few days he would get things going. And Santa had set out on this mission with great gusto and enthusiasm, while Mrs. Claus simply looked on. But she was secretly concerned and worried about her husband's health, as she had noticed a few signs that his health was not what it should have been. Mrs. Claus did not tell anyone about her concerns, except for her very trusted Rudolph, and they both agreed to keep a very close eye on Santa. Santa engaged his scenes in several sessions, and soon everyone was on board. One of the first things that Santa did was to assign reindeer Frosty and Misty to locate little Karina and her mom Lara. Then he would take care of the rest. Next, he assigned Snowbird Snowcone and Snowflake to locate Schofield, and then he assigned Lambs Rainbow and Raindrop to locate Kimberly and her son Lucas. Santa's building team consisted of well-chosen workmen and workwomen from around the world who were presently unemployed and who really needed the money and wanted to work. His large bunch of letter writers sent out thousands and thousands of letters to employment agencies, homeless shelters, and non-profit organizations seeking potential workmen and workwomen. Letters were also sent to agencies to and for persons with disabilities, or agencies of and for persons with disabilities, as well as to retiree associations. The letters had been well crafted so that no one would ever guess that it was Santa seeking employees, and they had all gone out under the name of the organization of his dear friend Kris Kringle. And Kris was known worldwide for his charitable missions. And Kris was the founder and CEO of the Kris Kringle International Foundation. All of the submissions were carefully read and chosen, and they were more than carefully vetted. Those who were interviewed were told that it was a private project to help and develop a Christmas resort for the less fortunate. Within a month, Santa had his group of workmen and workwomen, and they had been flown to the secret location to begin work. Sandy Claus and cousins Stoyan and Stefan took charge of this part of the project. Of course, Santa sought and received the assistance of his dear friends Marco and Nicholas to help him put security systems in place. So everything was now ready to go and started off with a huge bang. Mrs. Claus and Rudolph continued to keep a very close eye on Santa at every turn, and they had even recruited some of the kids to help keep an eye out on Santa's activities. And this is how it was at this present time. Part 3. Santa has a major setback. The Claus family had just finished having supper together, and most of them had already retired to their quarters. Santa and his wife were watching TV in their private Santa den. Santa was unusually quiet for tonight. He kept on smiling as usual, yes indeed, and his jokes were right on. But Mrs. Claus had noticed something else. Santa had started to favor the right side of his face. She became more concerned when he had started to get out of his chair and had fallen back with a groan. Mrs. Claus rushed to her husband's side and tried rousing him, but he did not budge, and he was much too heavy for her to maneuver. Mrs. Claus did not panic. She pressed the button for Rudolph to come immediately, and within minutes, the faithful reindeer was by her side. Santa was unconscious and seemed to be in a lot of pain, and he was groaning more loudly by the minute. Rudolph summoned Santa's medical team, and they loaded the unconscious Santa onto a stretcher. Rudolph raced to the sleigh loft and soon he was backing one of the sleighs out of the loft. The stretcher was loaded onto the sleigh with Santa on it, and then Rudolph took his place at the wheel, while Mrs. Claus and the medical team jumped aboard and took their places in the sleigh. Mercifully, no one had seen when Santa had been taken out, as a very secret private entrance and exit had been used, only to be used in an emergency for Santa and his wife. Rudolph drove directly to the exclusive medical North Pole facility, used only by Santa and his family, and anyone else in Santa's staff who required urgent medical treatment, and anyone who required urgent medical treatment from around the world. The doctors were waiting as the medical team had called ahead, and Santa was taken to a very private and pristine room, while Mrs. Claus and Rudolph waited for news outside. The doctors had worked feverishly on the big man for over an hour, and as the minutes ticked away, Mrs. Claus and Rudolph sat holding hands and praying for the welfare and health of their beloved Santa. Santa's medical team remained in the room with Santa, which seemed to Rudolph and Mrs. Claus to be for a very long time. Then the head doctor had come out to see Mrs. Claus and Rudolph. He told them that Santa was very, very sick. He had COVID, and it was very serious. They had wanted to do a medical procedure to help clear his tubes so that he could start breathing normally again. They had placed Santa on a ventilator and needed Mrs. Claus's consent to do the medical procedure. They had reassured Mrs. Claus and Rudolph that this procedure was not going to be life-threatening, and after it was done, Santa would be able to breathe on his own. But without it, Santa would need to remain on the ventilator, and this would not be good for him. Mrs. Claus took the proffered pen and signed the necessary papers, while Rudolph looked on, gently placing his arm around his beloved Mrs. Claus. Santa was not going to go anywhere for at least a week, and his recovery would determine how soon he would be allowed to return to the North Pole. And even then, he would need lots of rest and quiet, and his medical team would need to keep an eye on him. Rudolph had begun to cry, but it was Mrs. Claus who comforted him. The doctors had also agreed that Santa's brother, Sandy Claus, should come to the hospital. No one and no one else should be told for now. And while Santa was having his procedure done, Mrs. Claus waited outside and told Rudolph to go and fetch Sandy Claus immediately and bring him to the hospital. The tail end of winter was still present, and there it was. Snow and ice were still on the ground, not unusual for the North Pole at this time of the year. Sandy Claus was awakened, and Rudolph fetched and brought him to the hospital, where he joined Mrs. Claus. Mrs. Claus had called him and had had a brief conversation with him. And for the next few days, this tight little trio kept watch over their beloved Santa. And on the 6th day, Santa opened his eyes and smiled at his wife. and nodded his head at his brother and his dear Rudolph. Santa was back, but he was extremely weak and not yet out of the woods. Everyone knew only too well that it was going to be a real challenge to both keep Santa quiet as well as to try and keep his illness from the rest of the world. Santa Claus took charge of this, and he also brought cousin Santa Stoyan and Santa Stefan into the loop. They were now a part of the tight little circle, and they all swore to each other and to Santa that they would not tell anyone else until the go-ahead was given from Santa's doctors. For everyone knew that news like this, no matter how early in the year, could have a devastating effect on millions of people, from the oldest to the youngest, and from world leaders to the everyday person on the street. Santa's doctors gave strict instructions to have Santa barred from watching TV and from accessing the internet. He was not to see any news, nor to do any work. So Santa read lots of books, played cards with Mrs. Claus and Rudolph, and had light chats with Sandy, Stoyan, and Stefan. Santa, however, was not fooled. He had an idea of what was going on and how serious his illness was. So for most of the time, he cooperated with the doctors and nurses. Of course, folks at the North Pole had begun to notice Santa's absence, especially so as he was supposed to take part in the upcoming Easter activities. And now the Santa family had to come up with a plan. And this is what it was at this present time. Part 4. When bad news travels. As they often say, bad news almost always travels a lot quicker than the good news. Santa had spent 2 weeks in intensive care at the special hospital on the North Pole, and then another week in the regular ward before he returned to the North Pole. By that time, elves, helpers, Santa's domestic staff, and Santa's kids had all been told that Santa had contracted a bug of serious influenza and that he had had to be isolated until it got better. Of course, Marco and Nicholas were brought up to speed, and they stood ready to help in any way. The security guards had been put on very high alert, just in case that anyone might have had thoughts of snooping and sneaking onto the complex. But try as hard as they could, Sandy, Claus, and Stefan and Stoyan could not keep a lid on this story forever. Santa's recuperation went very well, and he received short visits from his reindeer Frosty and Misty, dolphins Sequin and Sea Jade, snowbirds Snowcone and Snowflake, and lambs Raindrop and Rainbow. His special mermaids, Janie and Mallory, had also dropped by one evening and had entertained Santa and Mrs. Claus with their singing and their entertaining. And this had definitely perked up Santa, as he had smiled from ear to ear as they sang and played. Mrs. Claus had insisted that the elves, the helpers, and the kids do short virtual sessions with their beloved Santa, and Santa had cherished it all. Towards the end of his recuperation period, and with Mrs. Claus's permission, Marco and Nicholas had visited, and had stayed at the North Pole for a few days, being very careful not to talk shop with Santa, who kept trying to do so. Rudolph had remained at the Claus's quarters throughout all of this time, serving as a sort of messenger between the Clauses and the rest of everyone. But the news somehow had broken on CNN and NBC on a late April evening, and from there, fake news had spread like wildfire. The headlines had started a little after 6 p.m. on CNN. Then NBC, ABC, and CBS had started to expand on their 7 p.m. news. After this, the news had spread north to Canada and rapidly across the pond to Britain and Europe. Of course, the Russians had added their nasty spins to the news, and then Asia had gotten a hold of it and had started broadcasting. Then it was the turn of the South Americans, the Caribbean, and then the African continent. Social media had started to go crazy, and soon the internet had followed and was inundated. In short, the headlines read, "Santa is very ill and not expected to live for very long." That was one of the headlines. What would the world be without Santa and Christmas? And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 5. The Unexpected Phone Call. Santa Claus and cousins Stoyan and Stefan had prepared for this event. Santa had not been told about this when the news had broken, but the entire North Pole had been placed in lockdown. Santa Claus would later discover how this had all started and would share it with Santa and the others. Kids, the elves, and the helpers were all told to return to their quarters and to stay there until further notice. And they knew well enough not to ask. They knew that something serious was taking place because they were all barred from watching TV or accessing the internet. The security guards had been placed on highest alert, and only certain staff were allowed to move about in order to keep the North Pole running. Lights across the North Pole were dimmed, and Santa Claus had given the order for the North Pole to be placed under a thick man-made fog. Banks of low-hanging man-made clouds were also used to cover the North Pole, thus completing the overhead coverage. The emergency security lines were activated, and Marco and Nicholas were brought in to manage them. Jamie and Mallory were placed on emergency standby. Santa's dependable reindeer, dolphins, snowbirds, and lambs were also briefed and put on alert. It did not take long, of course, for Hollywood to step in with their pontification, followed by all of the daily and nightly talk shows. And as many were saying, if Santa were to die, millions of kids and adults would be drastically affected. Businesses of all types and sizes globally would also be affected, and the movie industry, along with Disney, would suffer immensely. In short, the world as we knew it would literally be turned on its head. However, there were certain individuals, of course, who received this news with great gusto. Ah, yes, the 3 wise men were simply euphoric and literally jumping out of their skins because they thought that after all, they were not going to have to do anything. Santa would literally pass on, and that would be the end of Christmas. Early the next morning, following the headlines, news helicopters had started to circle above the North Pole, but they were unable to see very much because of the thick man-made fog and banks of low-hanging man-made clouds. The media had started to contact or trying to contact the North Pole, but phones were left to ring twice, and then the caller had received a busy tone. This only served to increase speculation that something was very wrong with Santa, but Santa Claus and the others had felt that this was the best solution for now. The G7 leaders, the EU, and NATO all convened emergency meetings to discuss the situation. The Pope and other religious leaders had begun to pray for Santa and to urge the world to do the same. Meantime, Santa was only told the bare minimum, and after consulting with his doctors, he had been administered enough sedation to keep him drowsy so that he would remain relaxed and not be agitated. The kids were led in prayer by their supervisors, and the elves and helpers did what they could to stay positive. However, Santa Claus, Stoyan, and Stefan did their best to reassure everyone that all was well and that things would soon be back to normal. And when Mrs. Claus had told the North Pole community that Santa was resting and being kept away from the news media, everyone had begun to relax. And soon the North Pole had begun to get back to business, very slowly. The man-made fog and banks of low-hanging man-made clouds remained in place for a few days longer, and the security lines and the security teams remained on highest alert as well. And while all of this was going on, world leaders continued their frantic negotiations around the clock. On the morning of the third day, following the start of the frenzy, Santa's private line began to ring, and it was Sandy Claus who had picked it up. Sandy listened, frowned, and then passed the phone to Mrs. Claus. She took it and listened to the soft voice at the other end, and then she hesitated. Santa would later tell his wife that it was a natural reaction on her part, as no one, not even he, would have expected to receive this call. Mrs. Claus knew that Marco and Nicholas were both listening in from their listening posts in the other room. And when she saw Marco give the thumbs up and hearing Nicholas's voice verifying the caller's number, she relaxed. The caller introduced himself to Mrs. Claus and gave her the secret code words known only to a very few in the world, including Santa. And he told her that he had a personal message from someone else. And this is how it was at this moment. Part 6, Unexpected Helping Hands. As Marco and Nicholas listened in, Sandy Claus and Santa's Stoyan and Stefan listened in. As the speaker phone was activated, Mrs. Claus first reassured the caller that Santa was very much alive and on the mend, that his appetite had started to improve, but that he was still being monitored by his doctors and that he was presently rested. But Santa Claus and Stoyan and Stefan were in charge and taking care of business. The caller seemed to be greatly relieved and breathed a huge sigh of relief in turn. Marco and Nicholas were able to connect the video portion of the security line. And lo and behold, everyone in the room could not believe their eyes when the image of King Charles III appeared on the monitor. Mrs. Claus knew that it was King Charles III after he had given her the secret code words, but did not have time to warn the others. So just imagine the surprise when everyone started to stare open-mouthed at the monitor. The king had told Mrs. Claus that the Pope had sent him a letter that he had received from the late Queen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, his late mother, a few weeks before she had passed on, and that the letter had contained specific instructions to be carried out if anything were to happen to her dearest Santa. Her Majesty had instructed the Pope only to give to her son, only in a dire emergency. And now he had done just that. The king read the letter, and then he had faxed it over the secure lines between the palace and the North Pole. Marco and Nicholas received it, made copies, took images of the letters as a backup, and had distributed the copies to the group. The king had gone on to tell Mrs. Claus that the world leaders had all agreed to play their part, and that even Russia and China had agreed to do their part. He also told Mrs. Claus that the Pope, that he felt he should deliver the news to Santa through the king, because the instructions had come from his mom, the late Queen Elizabeth, Her Majesty II. The group was absolutely stunned, and the king had signed off by letting Mrs. Claus know that he was standing by to help in any way. It was what the late Her Majesty would have wanted her son to do. Special instructions needed to be carried out, and the group had wasted no time in getting down to work. First, world leaders put out a joint press release stating that Santa was very much alive, and photos of the big man reclining in his chair were displayed. And there were even photos of Santa playing with his 2 dogs, and one of him walking in the garden of the North Pole with Mrs. Claus. It was now late spring. Things seemed to settle down after this, and the world had started to get back to its business. And at the beginning of the 3rd week in June, Santa was given the green light to return to work. All told, he had been laid up for almost 3 months, but the doctors had told him that he still needed to be careful. King Charles had been made the main spokesman and had been delegated to be responsible for helping Santa with his project and to use the resources of the British government to coordinate and execute this special mission. And other world leaders, believe it or not, did their part too. The construction of Santa's Christmas resort was going full steam ahead. And once more, Santa had become fully engrossed in this newest Christmas holiday mission, with Mrs. Claus making very sure that he followed doctors' orders. Several countries, including the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Italy, and countries of the EU all donated to help complete the resort on time. Several Asian and South American countries donated as well. Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, and others donated as well. Even Taiwan. And they went out of their way to assist. And by the end of October, the Royal Resort, as it was named, was almost ready. Actually, the resort looked something like this. Streets and streets of stores, shops, and restaurants. Parks, squares, and playgrounds. Thousands and thousands of mini cottages, mini cars, trains, and bikes for folks to board and tour the resort. Beaches, ski slopes, and skating rinks, walking trails, rivers, and lakes. Oh boy. In short, it was quite a resort to behold. Nothing ever seen before. And it all had to be kept as a top secret so that no one would get the idea to try and destroy it. King Charles III was magnificent in his management, with the British government going overboard with their help. And the world leaders had taken turns to talk about this great initiative. And Santa could be seen posing with each of these leaders in turn. Even the Russian leader did his part, and there had been a photo posted around the world with Santa with both leaders of Russia and China riding in a sleigh. It was quite a photo, with Santa smiling broadly and stroking his thick white beard, and the two leaders smiling up at him. But let's just say that not everyone was quite on board with this, especially Santa and King Charles. Santa had brought the king up to date about the three wise men, and the king had promised to use all of his resources to keep the three wise men at bay. The President of the United States had also played a major role in this massive project, sending lots of soldiers to help build, construct, and to store the various restaurants, shops, and stores with tons of food. The Canadians had also done their part, and other countries had gotten into line and followed suit. And this is how it was at this moment in time. Part 7. Secrets revealed and secrets unearthed. Queen Elizabeth's secret letter to the Pope was revealed to the world right after the world leaders had made their appearances, and the world was absolutely dumbfounded and shocked, to say the least. And then it was discovered that Russia was seriously thinking of ending the war with the Ukraine, handing back all of the territory that they had taken from the Ukraine to the Ukraine, including the Crimea, and offering to pay handsome remunerations to the Ukraine. But there were many who doubted this. And then there was a secret revealed that China had wanted to make a serious attempt with regard to seeking peace with Taiwan. This too was met with tremendous skepticism. Then how about the secret that was unearthed? That Trump had decided not to run for office in 2024. choosing to walk away into the sunset and never to return. Again, critics were not convinced. Then one evening in early November, Marco and Nicholas had found bugs planted in the huts of Santa's security guards. And that was not all. They had also found some listening devices planted in Santa's offices. And most serious of all, they had found some high-powered spy satellites lurking over the royal resort. It was now time to act. It had taken days for the massive North Pole complex to be swept for bugs, and the royal resort had also been swept from end to end. King Charles had ordered the British Army to sweep the northern part of the North Pole. The U.S. President had ordered his soldiers to do the same to the southern portion, while the Canadian Prime Minister had sent the RCMP to the west, and Japan and Korea had done the same to the east. As for the royal resort, Germany, France, and Italy took charge there, while the Israelis had proceeded to destroy the lurking satellites. It was also discovered that the so-called leak about Santa's so-called demise was caused by a guard who had inadvertently told this to someone at a bar one evening that Santa had been taken to hospital. And now the rest is history. And this is how it was at this particular moment. Part 8. The Identical Images. And it was no surprise when King Charles had reported to Santa and his team that there had been a breach of security at the royal resort. He was happy to report, though, that all of the commanders from the various countries had assured him that all of the bugs and the listening devices had been found, and destroyed, and that the Israelis had destroyed all of the lurking satellites. However, there were serious concerns when it came to making sure that the royal resort was completely secure. Time was now starting to count down, and it was now the end of November. Santa and his team had already sent out invitations to the chosen ones, and it would only be a matter of weeks before the first arrivees had shown up. Santa had arranged for Frosty and Misty to fetch Karina and her mom. This was the little girl who had written to Santa about her sick mom. So she was the little girl who had written to Santa about her sick mom and her missing dad. Karina and her mom would be brought to the royal resort via sleigh. Snowcone and Snowflake were going to fetch Schofield, the one who had written the letter to Santa about being all alone in the world after his family had passed on due to COVID, and he too would be brought to the royal resort, but in a Santa copter. And then Raindrop and Rainbow would fetch Lucas and his mom and bring them along to the royal resort. The mom who had written the letter to Santa about her sick little boy, Lucas, and they would be brought by a Santa copter as well. But, as always, something unforetold had happened just before the guests had started to arrive at the royal resort, and it was the Canadian and American soldiers who first saw it. And as they scrambled to alert the other soldiers, King Charles was alerted, and soon he had taken command. 2 large blimps had been spotted circling over the royal resort, but they were circling in different directions. Their flight patterns were very strange, and as the soldiers watched, one of them had headed for the man-made beach area, while the other had headed for the man-made ski slopes. King Charles pondered these reports as he sat at his desk, twirling a pen and sipping his third cup of tea. He had decided to confer with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada, as the other world leaders had appointed these two men to be the King's main confidants and advisors. There was not much time for decision-making, as the live reports had revealed that both blimps had landed, and they noticed that men dressed in ski suits and wetsuits had descended and started to fan out. Of course, the soldiers could easily have tackled these men and arrested them, but the king, the president, and the prime minister had wanted to see what these men were going to be up to, and they did not have to wait for too long. Each man could be seen removing their respective wetsuit and ski suit and stashing them in red bags on their backs. They were all now wearing red Santa suits, and each man was identically made up to look just like the real Santa Claus. The soldiers were absolutely shocked and horrified. What an uncanny resemblance! Who were they, and where did they come from? What were they up to? The soldiers waited with bated breath for the king to speak. They all started to walk towards the area of the main area of the royal resort. And by this time, king, president, and prime minister had been patched in via satellite and were now watching live as these fake Santa Clauses walked towards the main area. The Saudis were given the command to stand by and to get ready. And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 9. Santa emerges. For the next few minutes, king, president, and prime minister watched mesmerized as the fake Santa Clauses walked purposefully towards the main hub of the resort. And by this time, they had formed a sort of semicircle, and it looked as if they were going to encircle the main building. By this time, the Israelis had managed to start snapping photos from above, while the British airmen had started to fly helicopters over the fake Santa Claus men, as the US and Canadian soldiers had begun to close in. King Charles had issued urgent orders for the real Santa to be taken to a secret hiding place and to wait there. He had first to be located and then to be taken to the safe hideaway. And his security men had acted immediately, and it did not take long for the media to pick up this live event, with CNN, NBC, CBS, ABC, and every other major outlet showing live pictures of this event. They were all showing live images to the world. Those who saw these images were absolutely shocked and were beginning to panic. What now? What now? Where was the real Santa? Of course, the other world leaders had all been briefed, and they had begun urging their citizens not to panic. The real message, or the message, was that the real Santa was safely tucked away, and that these fake Santas would soon be arrested and taken into custody. And this did turn out to be the very truth at the end. Social media and the internet had begun to spread this news like wildfire, and almost every child and parent who had seen this had begun to cry openly. The Pope had offered to quell things by asking the world to pray with him. Santa, as it turned out, was having a therapy session with his aquatic coaches in his Santa warm pool. And when King Charles had contacted Sandy Claus with the news, Sandy Claus knew the drill and had wasted no time. Sandy Claus and Mrs. Claus had retrieved Santa's emergency kit and supplies and had raced to the warm Santa pool, where Rudolph, their trusted reindeer, was waiting for them. The aquatic coaches had been alerted ahead of time, and they had helped Santa out of the pool, and the big man did not panic, as he had undergone these types of drills several times over the years. So he knew the drill. But this time, the drill was not the drill. It was the real thing. And Santa had full confidence in his wife, his brother, and his team. Santa's hair was cut and pruned in a new hairstyle. His thick, long, white beard was carefully manicured to look different, and his original beard was safely put away in a large sealed case. So it would be easy to put back when this was all over. This was going to be a bit tricky, but his medical and cosmetic teams knew just how to do it. The mission here was to sneak Santa out of the North Pole unseen. Santa was prepared for flight. Mrs. Claus and Sandy Claus would accompany him. They would all dress in invisible suits, and trusty reindeer Rudolph would drive them in the emergency Santa copter. And as Rudolph waited for his flight plan, Sandy Claus brought his brother up to speed on what was happening. Santa had no doubt that these horrible three wise men were behind all of this, and he was bang on. The Santa aircraft, or the Santa copter, this was a special one, was only used in very special situations and in very special emergencies. It took off from the secret Santa runway. There were 2 Secret Service U.S. agents on board the aircraft, in addition to the others, plus Santa's head doctor and a nurse. Rudolph had taken the aircraft up to the banks of clouds, and soon it had disappeared into the clouds. The aircraft first turned south towards Alaska, but then it had changed course and headed for Canada. Then it had changed course once more and had headed for Europe. And as the flight progressed, the passengers had begun to relax, and soon Santa and the others were snoozing, except for those secret U.S. agents who had been playing cards to while away the time, while continuing at the same time to monitor the news closely. Once Santa had been awakened and served a yummy hot meal of roast potatoes, roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and hot apple pie. And this was one of his favorite meals. And then on another occasion he had been awakened and offered hot chocolate and chocolate chip cookies. The others ate and drank as well, and from time to time the U.S. secret agents had briefed Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus on what was going on in the rest of the world. Rudolph drove steadily, but after a few hours he gave way to one of the U.S. secret agents who continued to fly the Santa aircraft over the Atlantic throughout the night. And as the sun had started to rise over the Irish coast, the Santa aircraft began its descent. The aircraft landed smoothly and gently, and soon the doors were open, and King Charles bounded up the steps and entered the aircraft. He walked briskly down the aisle, greeting each person and shaking hands as he went. And then he and Santa had hugged each other warmly. The secret agent then escorted Santa out of the aircraft and were joined by other military and secret agents. Santa and his party were escorted to a private room in the Irish terminal, and from there King Charles III introduced the real Santa to the world. One can easily say that there was a huge collective sigh of relief around the world when Santa appeared. He was tired and a bit exhausted, but he assured the world that he was alive and returned to the North Pole as soon as it was no longer under siege. And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 10. Taking back territory. Several of the soldiers manning the royal resort had begun to close in on the fake Santas, while others had proceeded to secure and search the two blimps. And what they found was simply shocking. In short, detailed documents on how they planned to kidnap the real Santa and hold him hostage until after Christmas of this year, and to completely destroy the North Pole and the royal resort, and then to ransom Santa for billions of dollars. The North Pole was now back under lockdown, and the security team, with Marco and Nicholas in charge from their virtual posts, managing the security team. Things had to be minutely managed and coordinated. The fake Santas at the Royal Resort did not give up without a fight, as they had been armed with guns and ammunition, and their mission had been to keep the soldiers at the Royal Resort busy, while others attempted to take the North Pole and to seek and find Santa, and then to take him hostage. The soldiers at the Royal Resort eventually overcame the fake Santas, and they were all bundled into a makeshift huge bunker and secured there. No one was injured, and the advantage for the soldiers were that they were trained to fight, whereas the fake Santas were not as trained. Santa's security team and his soldiers and other security detail fought with purpose and zeal to retain Santa's precious North Pole. They once again covered the entire North Pole with man-made fog and man-made low-hanging banks of clouds. And then they had all dressed in their own Santa suits and hats and had waited. And they did not have to wait for too long. The error made by Santa's enemies were when they had become confused by the man-made fog and the low-hanging clouds, those low-hanging man-made clouds. They were all confused. And then by Santa's team, his security guards, who had all been dressed in their Santa suits and hats. And they were more or less just like the enemy too. The difference was that Santa's men wore gold whistles around their necks, adorned with the Santa emblem, and there was no way that the enemy had been able to copy this, because this part of Santa's uniforms had been a top secret. In addition, these whistles acted as devices that sent and received commands or messages to the command center, and they sent and received signals to the command centers. Santa's enemies were totally taken off guard, and it was very easy to capture the confused men. The 3 wise men were discovered among this group of men, and they were taken away and handed over to the North Pole cops. As soon as King Charles III had gotten word that both the North Pole and the Royal Resort were back in business and that they were fully secured, he activated his next steps. The king prepared to return with Santa and his entourage to the North Pole, and he made very sure that the media covered his arrival back to the North Pole. The whole world saw everything, and they witnessed the arrival of the big man back at his home, with Mrs. Claus and Santa Claus standing beside him. And then there were photos of Santa hugging his precious Rudolph and shaking hands with the US President, the Canadian Prime Minister, and even the British Prime Minister. These 3 had all been flown to the North Pole to greet Santa upon his arrival. And before he boarded the Santa aircraft to return, the medical and cosmetic teams had managed to reattach his original beard, as they had been flown to Ireland to do their job. The repeated headlines flashing across TV screens around the world read, "Welcome home, Santa. The world loves you." And it was now time for Santa to get down to the important business at hand, this being to welcome and host his special guests for this Christmas. And this is how it was at this moment in time. Part 11. Sea, Snow, and Mountains. And it was now a few days just before Christmas Day, and Santa and his team and his family were now all into the swing of things. Santa had welcomed those 3 persons who had written those touching letters to him. First, little Karina and her ailing mama from Poland. Santa's medical team had taken Laura to the hospital, and she was going to be okay. 2 days after their arrival, Santa had a surprise for them. Karina's dad, Andre, had been located in the Ukraine and had been flown to the North Pole. What a joyous reunion! And even Santa and Rudolph had shed some tears when these 3, Andre, little Karina, and their mom Laura, were reunited. And Mrs. Claus had hugged the 3 of them warmly. And then there was Schofield. Some of Santa's kids had moved into some of the little cottages when Schofield arrived, and had invited Schofield to join them. And for the next 2 weeks they had all bonded as a happy family. And then there was Kimberly and her son Lucas. And upon their arrival, Lucas had been given immediate treatment for his leukemia. And some of Santa's friends had come to the resort and had taken Kimberly and Lucas under their wings for the next 2 weeks. Little Lucas had improved markedly. Santa's special guests had included kids who had no one to take care of them or nowhere to go. They were all homeless, and this was a special treat for them. And then there were seniors whose families had disappeared in general, and they just did not have anyone to care for them. Adults who had become homeless due to horrible circumstances, and now they were here at Santa's invitation. The sign to the Royal Resort said, "Welcome home for the holidays." No one would ever forget the next few weeks. Beaches with seas so calm, and sand so soft and golden, and lush palm trees swaying gently in the breeze. Crabs running around, and then there were sailboats and yachts filled with folks enjoying the sun. Beach chairs crowded with sunbathers. There were ski slopes filled with skiers, and everyone dressed in snowsuits. And then there were the trails, and the ice rinks crowded with ice skaters, laughing and enjoying. And they were enjoying their skating. And there were blinking Christmas lights in the background, and soft playing Christmas music. Mountains filled with climbers of all ages, hiking trails, and trees filled with fantastic foliage. Birds of all colors singing sweetly in the trees, and tropical plants of all types and sizes. The squares were filled with fountains and aquariums containing colorful tropical fishes. The parks were filled with wading pools and ponds, and the playgrounds contained swings, merry-go-rounds, and everything else. And there were Ferris wheels too. There were small streets filled with shops and stores, and their shelves were jam-packed with all kinds of products, from foodstuffs to toys, games, and everything else imaginable. Everything was free to the purchaser. There were gaming arcades, libraries, craft shops, and stores, stocked with everything imaginable, from toys to clothes to electronics. And there were also sporting paraphernalia, kitchen gadgets, and furniture for the house, bakeries, delis, restaurants, and most of all, and in the middle of the resort, stood Santa's Christmas church with baby Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. The church was the most popular place for the guests, especially so at midnight for the Christmas Mass. And there was a huge nativity display next to the church, complete with all of the nativity figures. And this was lit every night. And what a beautiful display! In addition, there were creches and other religious artifacts displayed right across the royal resort. And this showed the inter-religious theme. There were trains, buses, trams, and many cars for guests to travel around the royal resort. And there were even cable cars for guests to travel up and down the mountains. The trains and cable cars were a great hit, as they had started at the top of the mountain and traveled right down to the beaches. There were bicycles, scooters, and water taxis, canoes, kayaks, and many helicopters, riverboats, and water cars on the lakes. Other hits included the mini Christmas castles, the gingerbread houses, and the magnificent swans, geese, and ducks in their own ponds. In short, there was something for everyone: sea, snow, and mountains. No one could ever say that they could not find something to like. Santa's kids were simply magnificent. They were the perfect hosts and tour guides, and they wore red uniforms with gold trim, with white Santa hats and the Santa whistle adorned with the Santa emblem around their necks. Many of the soldiers from those countries that were sent to protect the royal resort stayed on at the invitation of Santa and Mrs. Claus, and they helped to make things comfortable and enjoyable. The small Santa cottages had been nicely decorated with the Santa theme: red cottages, white cottages, gold cottages, and green cottages, and a lovely Christmas tree in the foyer of each cottage. And they were all decorated with beautiful ornaments and lights, with a star at the top, and lots of gifts beneath the tree. And there were lots of decorations everywhere in those restaurants, cozy little restaurants and large busy restaurants. Every day, Santa Claus and his two friendly dogs, along with Mrs. Claus and Sandy Claus and the rest of the family, made sure to be seen around the resort. And this is how it was at this very moment. Part 12. A special Christmas. And now the real celebrations had started at around 5 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Invitations and programs had been dropped off at all of the cottages, stores and shops, restaurants, and everywhere else. First, there was a Santa parade in the main square of the resort, and this was made up of Santa, his family, reindeers, elves, and his helpers. Sandy Claus and Santa Stefan and Stoyan were also there. The floats and the bands were simply magnificent. Horse-drawn trucks with fairies and Disney characters. And then came the huge buffets at all of the restaurants. Lots of foods of all kinds. International appetizers, main courses, and desserts. And then the concerts. And lo and behold, Santa's precious mermaids, Jamie and Mallory, performed their magnificent shows. And the reindeer did their acrobats in the main square. Then the dolphins did their ballet on the man-made lakes and rivers and in the sea, followed by the lambs with their moon leaps in the lush meadows and their balloon dances in the streets. And finally, the snowbirds did their flybys. And then it was time for Santa's kids to bring down the curtain. And they did not disappoint. They sang, danced, did high wire acrobats, trapeze shows, air walks, and played short games of air football, air hockey, and air basketball. All of this in the air. And they ended their particular segment with special scenes, with air skating races and air displays. The audiences were completely wowed. And now it was just 1 minute to midnight, and Santa led the countdown to midnight. And at the stroke of midnight, midnight mass began at Santa's Christmas church. And the surprise of the night, the Pope conducted Mass virtually from Rome. Then it was all over for yet another Christmas. The royal resort was asleep shortly after Christmas Mass had ended. And as they slept, Santa and his family hosted King Charles III and those world leaders who had helped save this Christmas. The end. I hope you enjoyed this specific episode and are enjoying my other episodes. I look forward to seeing you again for my next episode, Santa's Magic Marvels. Hope you enjoyed it. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas, everybody. And we'll see you one more time.